the old man hit the water at 5:08 in the afternoon, and the only sound that followed was laughter, three sharp, drunk voices ricocheting off the pier above him. He went under for a count of two, maybe three, and then his head broke the surface, calm as a buoy. He didn't shout. He didn't thrash. He just blew water from his nose, blinked the salt out of his eyes, and reached one weathered hand sideways through the chop until his fingers closed around the wooden cane he had carried for 16 years. He never let go of that cane. Not in the fall. Not under the water. Not now, treading easy in the cold Pacific with a swell rolling against his ribs. Above him, on the warm, sun-washed planks, the three young men in pastel polo shirts were filming him on their phones, doubled over, calling him grandpa, calling him fossil, calling him names the wind would later refuse to carry. None of them noticed the 30-foot fishing boat slowing down 100 yards off the pier, or the four gray-haired men on its deck who had just stood up at once, like a single body, and gone very, very still. To understand what was about to happen on that pier in Coronado, you have to first understand the man in the water, and you have to understand him slowly, the way the ocean understands a stone. His name was Cyrus Buchanan, 67 years old. Master Chief, United States Navy, retired. 31 years of service, most of which he never spoke about and never would. He walked with a slight hitch in his right hip, a parting gift from a night jump in 1987 that had landed him a little harder than the manual recommended. But the hitch only showed when he was tired, and he was rarely tired in any way a stranger could see. His hair had gone the color of dry driftwood. His eyes were a pale, washed sea glass green that people sometimes called kind and sometimes called unreadable, depending on whether or not they had ever needed something from him. He lived in a small stucco house at the top of a narrow street that looked down over the bay, 2 blocks from the pier, in a neighborhood where the mailboxes were still painted by hand, and the neighbors still knew which dog belonged to which porch. His wife Ellen had died the previous March. 28 years of marriage. She had been a second-grade teacher, the kind who remembered every student's birthday for the rest of her life, and Cyrus had loved her with a steady, unflashy love. After she was gone, he had not fallen apart. He had simply gone quieter, the way a house goes quieter when the kettle stops singing. Her photograph still sat on his desk by the window, a faded picture from a beach trip in Oregon, her hair caught mid-laugh in the wind, and every morning he would touch the corner of the frame and say good morning to her, and every evening say good night. It was not a ritual he discussed. It was just the shape his days had taken. Twice a week on Wednesdays and Saturdays, Cyrus walked to the public pier with a tackle box, a rod, a battered green thermos of black coffee, and the cane. He had been doing this for 12 years. Long before Ellen got sick. Long before retirement had really felt like retirement. The regulars on the pier knew him as Cy, just Cy, the old guy with the slow, easy smile and the careful hands who never crowded another fisherman's spot, and who, more than once, had quietly handed a struggling stranger a better lure and walked away before anyone could thank him. They did not know about the Trident on the inside of his locker at home. They did not know about the dives off the coast of Mindanao, or the long flat weeks in the Hindu Kush, or the nights on a moonless beach in Central America, where breathing too loudly could have ended a life. They knew that Cy fished. They knew that Cy was widowed. They knew that Cy tipped the bait shop kid $2 even when his bucket was empty. That was all they needed to know, and he preferred it that way. That late spring Saturday in 2024 had begun like 1,000 others. He had risen at 5:30. He had drunk 1 cup of coffee standing up, the way the Navy had taught him. He had spoken his good morning to Ellen's photograph. He had packed his tackle, slid his cane under his arm, and walked the 420 steps down the hill. He had counted them once, and the number had never changed, until the sea opened up in front of him and the planks of the pier creaked their familiar hello under his shoes. What he didn't know was that 9 miles offshore, at almost exactly that same hour, 4 other men were walking out onto a deck and squinting into the same bright Pacific sun. Their names were Ray Castellan, Walt Pickering, Donnie Alvarez, and Marcus Mojo Whitfield. 71, 69, 68, and 67 years old. They had graduated from Bud S. Class 106 together in 1978. They had been groomsmen at one another's weddings, pallbearers at one another's funerals, and every spring for the last 22 years they had chartered the same fishing boat out of San Diego for a long weekend they called, with quiet humor, the annual floating reunion. There were originally 6 of them. They were down to 5, and one, Cyrus, had told them this year he would meet them at the pier at sunset instead of joining the charter. They were planning to pull alongside the pier at around 6. Back on shore, the trouble had started just after 4. A glossy white 40-foot pleasure cruiser had docked at the marina an hour before, unloading 24 tech employees from a startup that had, the day prior, closed a Series A funding round. The boat had been hired for what their internal calendar called a victory cruise, champagne since 11, sun since noon. By 3, the deck speakers were thumping bass over the water in a way that made the pelicans lift off the pilings in offended slow circles. By 4, 3 of the younger employees, 23, 24, 25, had spilled out onto the pier with red plastic cups in their hands and a half-finished bottle of Prosecco tucked under one arm. They wore the uniform of their tribe, pastel polos, designer shorts, white sneakers that had never once been muddy, and the warm Pacific afternoon had hit them harder than any of them realized. They had wandered down the pier with the loose, looping gait of drunk men who believed themselves to be charming. They had pointed at gulls. They had toasted a couple on a bench. And then they had come, eventually, to the quiet end of the planks, where an older man in a faded blue ball cap sat on a low folding stool with a rod over the rail and a battered green tackle box at his feet, working a hook out of the corner of a small surf perch with the patient, gentle hands of someone who had once taken a sliver of shrapnel out of a brother's neck with the same kind of care. It was the tackle box they fixated on first. One of them, a tall one named Tyler, 24 years old, the loudest of the 3 by some margin, squatted down beside it and pretended to be an archaeologist examining a relic. "Bro," he said, looking up at his friends with a grin, "this thing is older than my dad. Look at this. Look at this fossil tackle." His friend, a stockier one named Brennan, 25, laughed too hard and slapped Tyler on the back. The third, Jordan, 23, with the kind of nervous laugh that always followed the other 2 by a half-second, looked at Cyrus and then looked away, suddenly uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to leave. Cyrus did not look up from his hook. He did not say a word. He simply finished freeing the small fish, leaned over the rail, and let it slip back into the green water with a soft, unhurried plop. That should have been the end of it. It was not. Tyler, encouraged by his audience, kept going. He picked up one of Cyrus's lures, a hand-tied bucktail that had been Ellen's last birthday gift to him, and dangled it from his fingers. "Yo, old-timer," he said. "This even legal anymore? This looked like something from World War II, my guy." Cyrus reeled in another few feet of line and said, very quietly, "Please put that back, son." His voice was so low and so even that even Tyler heard the word son and felt, somewhere underneath the Prosecco, a small, embarrassing flicker of childhood. He didn't put the lure back. He tossed it instead, not far, just a few feet, but tossed it onto the planks. And then, encouraged by the silence that followed, he reached down with one foot, and with a kind of stagey casualness, nudged the entire green tackle box closer to the edge of the pier. "Oops," he said. His friends laughed. Cyrus turned his head slowly and looked at him for the first time. The look lasted maybe 2 full seconds. Tyler, later, in a holding cell with a paper cup of cold coffee in his shaking hand, would remember that look as the longest 2 seconds of his life. It was Brennan, the stockier one, who actually did it. He stepped past Tyler with a sloppy grin and, in one quick motion, kicked the tackle box. It went over the edge with a clatter and a small white splash. Hooks, swivels, weights, the bucktail, the folded photograph of Ellen that Cyrus had tucked into the lid years ago and never moved. All of it went down into the green Pacific in a slow, sinking cloud. Cyrus made a small sound, not a word, just an exhale, and rose from his stool. He did not lunge at the boy. He simply set his rod down across the rail, leaned his cane against the planks, and lowered himself slowly to one knee at the edge of the pier, peering over to see if any of the box was still floating. His back was to them. His weight was forward. His old hip was unlocked. He looked in that moment exactly as the three young men needed him to look: small, old, kneeling, and Brennan, who had never in his life touched a man who could not touch him back, planted one white sneaker against the small of Cyrus's back and shoved. The fall was 12 feet. Cyrus did not turn in the air. He hit the water flat on his shoulder, went under, and stayed under long enough for the laughter on the pier to start before he came up. When he surfaced, his cap was gone, his hair was plastered to his forehead, and one hand was still wrapped tight around the cane. He blew water out of his nose. He looked up at the three faces leaning over the rail, phones out, recording, howling, and he did not say a single word. He simply turned in the water, oriented himself toward the nearest piling, and began to swim. Slow, steady, methodical. One arm reaching, one arm cradling the cane against his chest, his bad hip kicking in a long, smooth scissor that he had not used in earnest in 20 years, and that, to his quiet surprise, came back to him as easily as a prayer he had once known by heart. Halfway down the pier, an older man named Wesley Hollander, 71, retired Coast Guard, a fishing buddy of Cyrus's for 9 years, had seen the whole thing. Weeze did not shout. Weeze did not run. Weeze did not even raise his voice toward the three drunk boys at the end of the pier. He simply pulled his phone out of his shirt pocket, scrolled to a single contact in his favorites, a contact saved under the single letter R, and pressed it. He held the phone to his ear. He waited until the line connected. He counted under his breath 1, 2, 3. And then, without ever speaking a word, he hung up. Out on the water, 9 miles closer now than they had been at dawn, on the deck of a 30-foot charter called the Sea Maven, Ray Castellan's phone buzzed once in his shirt pocket. He pulled it out. He looked at the screen. He saw the letter W and the 3-second timestamp, and he did not say anything for a moment. Then he looked up at the other 3 men on the deck, and the look on his face was a look they had all worn before, a long time ago, in places where the air smelled of diesel and salt and other things. "Captain," Ray said, very quietly, to the man at the wheel, "I need you to put us alongside the public pier in Coronado. Right now. And I need you to do it without questions." The captain, who had known Ray for 11 years and had never once been spoken to in that tone, did not ask questions. He simply turned the wheel. The pier was 50 feet away from Cyrus when the engine of the Sea Maven cut behind him. He heard it before he saw it. The sudden, soft quieting of a diesel he had heard 1,000 times. He turned in the water, still moving steadily, and the boat slid alongside him with the practiced gentleness of a man who had been parking boats since before half the people on the pier had been born. A long, sun-dark arm reached down over the gunwale, Donnie Alvarez's arm, the same arm that had once dragged Cyrus out of a flooded equipment locker in the Gulf of Aden in 1991, and another arm reached down beside it. Cyrus passed up the cane first. Then he passed up his hand. They pulled him out of the water cleanly, the way you pull a brother out of water, with no wasted motion and no fuss. He stood on the deck, dripping, breathing slow, and looked at the 4 faces in front of him. Ray, Walt, Donnie, Mojo. None of them said anything for a long moment. Then Ray reached out and put one steady hand on the back of Cyrus's wet neck, the way they had been doing to one another since they were 19 years old, and said, "We've got you, brother." That was all. They got him a towel. They did not hurry. Ray first, then Walt, then Donnie, then Mojo, with Cyrus behind them, walking slow and dry now, the cane back in his hand. They came down the planks of the pier with the unhurried, settled gait of men who had nothing left to prove to anyone, least of all to three boys in pastel polos. Tyler saw them first. He had been laughing into his phone, narrating the video he had just shot, and his sentence trailed off mid-word. Brennan turned to see what Tyler was looking at. Jordan, the youngest, already pale, already sober in the way that fear sobers a man faster than coffee ever could, took one half-step backward and then stopped, because there was nowhere to go but off the pier, and he had just watched what happened to the last man who had gone off this pier. The four old SEALs did not raise their voices. They did not lay a hand on the boys. They simply stopped, about 6 feet from them, and spread out across the planks in a slow, easy arc that, by some quiet geometry none of the boys could later describe, left absolutely no path back down the pier. Other fishermen, sensing what they were looking at without understanding it, had quietly stepped back. A woman with a stroller had stopped. Wes Hollander stood 20 feet behind the four men with his arms folded, saying nothing. Ray Castellan, the oldest, looked at the three young men for a long moment, taking them in the way an old carpenter takes in a warped board, without anger, without surprise, only with the patient attention of a man who has seen a great deal of warped wood in his life. Then he spoke. "You pushed an old man off this pier," Ray said. His voice was low, deliberate, and entirely without heat. "He's our brother. So this is what's going to happen now. You're going to stay right where you are. You are not going to run, because I promise you, son, you will not get past us, and I would prefer that none of us start the rest of our day with a scuffed knee. You're going to give us your full names. You're going to call the harbor police yourselves, on your own phones, so the call is in your own voice. And then one of you, I don't care which one, is going to climb down that ladder and swim down and bring up his tackle box. Because what you knocked into the water did not belong to you. And one more thing," he paused. He did not blink. "You're going to look him in the eye, and you're going to apologize. Not to me. To him." Tyler opened his mouth to say something, anything, and Walt Pickering, 69, the quietest of the four, simply raised one finger an inch off his thigh, and Tyler's mouth closed. Brennan was crying without making a sound. Jordan had already pulled his phone out and was dialing 911 with shaking fingers before Ray had finished his sentence. None of the four old men moved. They did not need to. The pier itself seemed to be holding its breath. 11 minutes later, 2 harbor police officers walked the length of the pier with their hands on their belts, slowing as they took in the strange, still tableau: 4 gray-haired men standing in a loose half-circle, 3 young men in pastel shirts standing very still inside it, an older man in dry clothes off to one side leaning lightly on a cane, and a green tackle box, dripping, sitting on the planks at his feet, with a single bucktail jig laid carefully across the top of it. Brennan, the one who had done the kicking, was barefoot and wet up to the chest. He had been the one sent down the ladder. He had found the box on the second dive. He had brought it up. He had set it at Cyrus's feet with his hands shaking, and he had said, in a voice that did not sound like the voice he had used an hour earlier, "I'm sorry, sir. I am so sorry." Cyrus had looked at him for a long moment, the same long, quiet look he had given Tyler on the planks, and had said only, You will be, son. Not as a threat, as a kind of prophecy. The three were arrested for assault and detained on the spot. Tyler tried once in the patrol car to talk about lawyers and his father. The officer in the front seat did not turn around. By the time the squad cars pulled away from the pier, the sun was beginning its long, slow drop toward the water and the gulls were coming back to the pilings. And within 90 minutes, a black SUV had pulled into the marina lot at the foot of the pier, and a man in a wrinkled linen shirt had climbed out of it and walked, fast, all the way down to where Cyrus was sitting with his brothers on a bench at the end of the planks. The man's name was David Mensa. He was 34 years old. He was the CEO of the startup that had thrown the boat party. He had been on the cruiser when his head of HR had called him. He had not waited to be told twice. David Mensa did not make excuses. He sat down on the bench across from Cyrus. He looked at the four old seals, and he nodded once at each of them, slowly, the way you nod when you are introducing yourself to people whose names you have not yet earned. Then he turned to Cyrus and he said, "Plainly, sir, those three men are no longer employed by my company. As of 19 minutes ago. We have a clause. They violated it before the police even arrived." He took a breath. He said, "I would also like to offer you personally whatever settlement you feel is right. Medical, damages, whatever number you want to say out loud, I will write it down right now, and it will be in your account by Monday morning." He had a pen in his hand. He was not performing. He was waiting. Cyrus looked at him for a long time. The sun was on the water. The water was full of light. "I don't want your money, son," Cyrus said finally. His voice was very gentle. "I want those three boys to do 200 hours of community service at the VA hospital up the road. Supervised. Real work. Not a photo op. And I want my friend Weez here to be the one signing their hours card. That's the only thing I want. If you can make that part of whatever the courts decide, we're square." David Mensa looked at him. He looked at Weez. He looked back at Cyrus. Then he wrote it down. He said, "Done." He said, "I'll call the prosecutor tonight. I will personally make sure it becomes a condition." He said, "Sir, may I ask your name?" And Cyrus, who had been Cy on this pier for 12 years and had liked it that way, looked at him for a long moment and finally said, "You can call me Cy. Everyone here does." A year passed. The pier did not change much. The planks were repainted in October. A new bait shop kid took over from the old one. The pelicans came and went. Cyrus still walked down the hill on Wednesdays and Saturdays with his rod and his tackle box and his battered green thermos of black coffee, and the regulars still called him Cy, and most of them never learned what had happened that one Saturday in late spring, because the four men who had pulled him out of the water had asked the people on the pier, very quietly, not to make a thing of it, and the people on the pier had honored that. The video Tyler had taken was never posted. His phone, by court order, had been wiped. The story stayed where stories like that belong, in the bones of the people who lived it. Tyler had served his hours and then gone home to his parents' house in Sacramento and not been heard from again, at least not on this pier. Brennan, the one who had kicked, had served his hours and then signed up for another 200 on his own and was, the last anyone had heard, still pushing a cart of clean linens down the long, bright hallways of the VA on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, very quietly, the way a person pays a debt that no court actually requires. Jordan, the youngest, had finished his hours and then asked Weez if he could keep coming, because something had happened to him on that pier that he could not name and did not want to lose, and Weez had said yes. Jordan had gone into therapy. Jordan now spent Saturday mornings at a community center 2 towns over, mentoring 14-year-old boys who reminded him a little too much of himself at 14. He had not had a drink in 11 months. The pier had, sometime in the late summer, gained a small bronze plaque near the bait shop, screwed neatly into a piling. It read only, "This pier honors quiet service and the friends who answer the call." No names. No date. No explanation. The plaque had been paid for, anonymously, by a young CEO who had stopped throwing boat parties and had instead, every December, begun donating a portion of his company's holiday budget to the same VA hospital up the road. Nobody who walked past the plaque ever quite knew what it was about, and that was, somehow, the point. The four men, Ray, Walt, Donnie, Mojo, came back to the pier twice that year. Once in the fall, for a long lunch on a bench with paper containers of fish and chips balanced on their knees, and once in the spring, for the annual floating reunion which now ended, by quiet unanimous agreement, with all five of them. Yes, five fishing off the public pier at sunset, with Cyrus's small grandson Theo, who was 8 years old and very serious about bait, sitting at the end of the row with a child-sized rod in his hands and an enormous, careful expression of concentration on his face. Theo had come to live near Cyrus 3 months after the incident. His mother, Cyrus and Ellen's only daughter, had moved back to Coronado to be closer to her father after Ellen's passing, and the boy had taken to the pier the way some children take to a piano. He fished on Saturdays now, beside his grandfather. He did not yet know any of the story. He only knew that his grandfather was the calmest man he had ever met, and that the four old men who showed up sometimes with sun-leathered hands and quiet eyes called him sir and meant it, and that on this pier, with this man, he was safe in a way he could not yet put into words. On Veterans Day the following November, Cyrus had been asked, very gently, by the principal of the local middle school, if he would speak to the students. He had thought about it for a long time. He had finally said yes. He had stood in the small school gym, in front of 300 children in folding chairs, with his cane in one hand and the other hand resting flat on the small wooden lectern, and he had told a story. He had not used any names. He had not mentioned Coronado, or the pier or pastel polo shirts, or boat parties or Bud S. He had simply said, there was an old man once who got pushed into some cold water by 3 young men who did not know him. And there were 4 other old men, far away on a boat, who did know him. And there was a 5th man, an older man with a phone in his pocket, who had once been a Coast Guard rescuer, and who, when he saw what happened, did not yell and did not run and did not panic. He just made a phone call that lasted 3 seconds and said nothing and hung up. And those 4 men on the boat, he had paused there in the gym, and the children had been entirely silent. Those 4 men on the boat turned around. Because once upon a time, a long time ago, they had all agreed, without ever quite saying it out loud, that if any one of them ever needed any of them, that was all it would take. 3 seconds. No words. The line and the silence and the trust. He had looked out at the children then in their folding chairs, and he had smiled a small, tired, peaceful smile. The kind of smile a man can only earn, and he had said, the only point I want you to take home today, the only one, is this. Be the friend that picks up. Be the friend that turns the boat. And if you are ever the old man in the water, hold on to your cane and swim slow, and trust that the people who love you are already coming. He had not said anything else. He had stepped down from the lectern. He had walked with his slight hitch out into the bright California morning. And on Saturday, at the usual time, he had been back on the pier, with his rod and his battered green tackle box and his grandson Theo at his side. The sun had been on the water. The water had been full of light. Somewhere out beyond the breakwater, a 30-foot charter boat had been making slow, lazy circles, 4 old men on its deck squinting into the same Pacific they had squinted into for nearly 50 years, and one of them, Ray Castellan, 72 now, still oldest, had glanced toward the shore, toward the small, distant figure of a man and a child on a pier, and had nodded once, very slightly, to no one in particular. 3 drunks on a warm spring afternoon long ago had not known who they pushed. His brothers had already been coming for dinner. And the pier in the end, the planks, the pilings, the quiet, the gulls, the long red sunset over the bay, the pier had seen exactly who he was.